Welcome to Season 3 of the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. More history, more people, more of the stuff that got you here in the first place. Thanks for listening.
1, 2, 3, jump!
Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome once again to another episode of the Knowledge from the Couch podcast, your favorite time-hopping history podcast with your host, Kyle. That is me. That is the voice that you're listening to currently. How is everyone? How's it going? How's your life? How's your wife? How is all of it happening? Today's episode number 47, as we inch closer and closer to the 50th episode of the show. Today's episode, we are going to continue our journey through the land of civics. I know some of you aren't really a fan of civic conversation, especially the American version of civics, but I personally find it extremely interesting. It's a very fun time, at least in my head, to talk about the opposition of different people's ideas. It's American politics and civics in general has always been a battleground, so to speak, and it's always interesting to go around and look at the different issues that affect different people. Now, you always hear this whole thing these days about, oh God, if we have, America's never had such a tribal mentality between political parties. America's always has always had this sort of very civil discourse where, you know, at least everybody had this bottom baseline morality that they never ever questioned, and even though they had differential opinions on some of their ideology, and in the end of the day, they all got along perfectly. That is a load of cooked up bullshit for sure. America has been as tribal of a mentality between people as anyone in the world for the entirety of its existence as a nation. As we saw last week when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, obviously the biggest issue there was the issue of slavery, and some people who were for it and some people who were very much against it. And obviously there were people in the middle who didn't really give a shit about it, but in the end, the people making the decisions were all a bunch of white dudes. So of course, since they weren't the slaves themselves, there was always going to be a small amount of apathy attached to the idea of it. But anyhow, that is getting down the track a little too far before the episode starts. Today's episode, we are going to talk about popular sovereignty, and in particular, how it affects Kansas. Yes, the state of Kansas. I am a Nebraskan myself, so it is very easy for me to want to make fun of Kansas, our neighbor to the south, but really it is a very similar state to the one that I am from, and it has a very interesting historical niche in these here United States, particularly in the story of Bleeding Kansas. We are going to talk about popular sovereignty. We are going to talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we are going to talk about Bleeding Kansas on this, the 47th episode of the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. Guys, stick with me. So before we get into the cast and characters of Bleeding Kansas, sounds like kind of a really sad musical, doesn't it? Bleeding Kansas. It's. I don't mean to make fun. It is actually a very serious time in the history of the United States, but there are people that go along with it that helped to instigate and I guess you could say finish the fight when it came to Bleeding Kansas. But before, just like we like to talk about on a seemingly weekly basis these days, we need to speak about context, because context is literally everything when it comes to these things. Nobody just decided to wake up one day and just fight each other for no good fucking reason. There were things leading up to the incident, or the set of incidents known as Bleeding Kansas. The two things we need to set ground for are popular sovereignty and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, we already did lay a great foundation of context last week, and if you haven't heard that episode, go back and download the Missouri Compromise episode and watch me talk about civics for 45 straight minutes. It's a real interesting look into the Missouri Compromise, but long story short for that one, the Missouri Compromise basically said, hey, here's the 3630 parallel line. No states above this can be slave states, and any state below it can be a slave state. So below this line is slave state, and above this line you shall not pass. And the only exception is the state of Missouri, which basically completely and utterly is above that line. So Missouri gets to become a state in the Union as a slave state, while Maine joins the Union as a free state, keeping the tenuous balance of power in the Congress between those states that supported the owning of people and those states that did not. So the big thing about the Missouri Compromise is it takes away the power of the citizenry to make the decision on whether their state would have slavery or no. Instead, it puts that power into an already predetermined sort of geographical feature that said, well, here's a line. If you're below this, you can have slavery, and if you're above it, you don't get to have slavery. The biggest misdeed, I guess you could say, with this particular thing is that those people who owned slaves didn't think of their slaves really so much as people as they thought of them as property, and they were mad that if they were transporting their slaves around to a different territory in the United States, say they wanted to make it big elsewhere besides those already established regions in the Deep South, that they couldn't take their, I guess, duly bought property with them to what would be considered a free state area. They were mad because this is what white people get mad about. I got my property, and I want to take it to my new house, and this goddamn law is not allowing me to take my property where I want it to go. So you start to have the rumblings of this new idea that, and it's not really a new idea, obviously. It's really kind of an old idea, but this new idea in its particular context of saying, hey, instead of the federal government telling us where and when we can have slavery, how about we just have the people in the states or territories, how about we have them vote on it? How about we have these people say, hey, we're all going to have slavery, or hey, we're all not going to have slavery? Sounds pretty good on paper, right? Sounds like a reasonable thing. Now, first of all, I have to, obviously lay the track down firstly. That says I obviously don't endorse slavery, and I don't mean to speak of it if you're taking it that way in such light tones. Of course, slavery is abhorrent, and it is awful, and it is one of the darkest times and things that you can talk about in the history of the United States. The fact that the United States is one of the final holdouts of slavery in the civilized world is one of the worst things that those of us who are American citizens will always have to deal with as part of our respective and collective pasts. So, but anyhow, in this time, in the context, as we always say is king, in the context of this time, those who did own slaves did not see those people, and yes, they are people, just as much as you or I. They did not see those people as anything more than their own pieces of property, and they, when they wanted to move to somewhere, wanted to take them with them. So they figured, hey, how about instead of some other entity deciding what we can or can't do, how about us, the people, right? We, the people, the United States, we're going to decide what we want to do. And like I said, it sounds really great on paper. I mean, isn't that the entire point of the United States? Isn't that the point, that we, the people, decide what we want to do with, the direction of our country? It sounds really great. That's kind of where it ends, though, is where it sounds. It's this idea that obviously, the consent of the governed is the power in which we derive, what we want to do. The big thing about it is, though, is that the people, in We the People, tended to be, like we just said, a bunch of white men. That's it. No women, no minorities or people of color, no Native Americans, obviously no black people either. It just tended to be a bunch of white dudes making the call. So on that part, it's already a flawed meaning, because We the People was really a very small subgroup of the actual people that all lived in the United States at the time. At the same time, you can already see where this sort of thing is going to go wrong, because if you have these new territories and a bunch of open land in the United States that doesn't have a bunch of people in it, and we think, hey, now we're going to try to use popular sovereignty or the vote of the people to decide whether something is a slave state or not, instead of the Missouri Compromise, what do you think happened very quickly thereafter? If your answer is A, the people who are already living there assembled peacefully and had a little vote and figured it out, you would be extremely wrong. The actual answer is B, a whole bunch of people from either camp, yes, that tribal mentality, those who loved slavery and those who didn't, rushed to become citizens in these, established residents in these states long enough to vote and sway the election in a certain direction. Of course, it wasn't just the people who were living there that were going to make this decision. It was a bunch of other randos that were going to pop into the area with their own, ideas of how something should be, and go ahead and start making up their mind. This is the idea of popular sovereignty, and this is how it worked in the United States, and it is all because of a little thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, as we mentioned a little earlier during the caning of Charles Sumner episode way early on, and we will mention those gentlemen involved in that little brawl a little bit later on. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the man who would eventually become the Democratic ticket holder in the election of the United States, who would eventually, go against the Abraham Lincoln, was one of the primary people who drafted the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 with the approval of then-President Franklin Pierce. The initial purpose of this act was to open up the thousands of new farms and make feasible a Midwestern transcontinental railroad. But inside of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there was the Popular Sovereignty Clause, which meant to basically completely and utterly repeal the Missouri Compromise, which was already established back in 1820, that said, hey, this is the line you shall not cross. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they basically said, okay, that's all over now. We want, wherever they go, to be able to decide whether they want to be a slave state. And really, on its nose, Douglas and others just kind of wanted to have this territory open up and have it become part of the United States so they could eventually make this transcontinental railroad thing a true thing, because the United States was growing much faster than people thought it would. And having a railroad go all the way across the country from coast to coast would be a huge boon to the economy throughout the entirety of the nation. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act sought to help organize these territories in the middle of the country, the Kansas and Nebraska territories, into these places that would eventually, make true the Transcontinental Railroad. Unfortunately, like many things in Congress, there is a lot of extra wording and pork involved in these things. And part of the extra wording involved was the addition of the Popular Sovereignty Clause. And the big reason why this particular clause worked its way into the Kansas-Nebraska Act is because of a man named David Atchison. David Atchison was a senator from the state of Missouri, so, already representing that situation, who decided that he, in his own words, he said he would rather, quote, see Nebraska sink in hell before he would allow it to be overrun by free soilers, unquote. Free soilers is the term for people who were, there were this little like dinky third political party sort of thing that was very short-lived during this, time in the late 1840s, early 1850s, that were very anti-slavery, very pro, every new territory should be free, and, the people who work the land and that should be free to work the land and make the money off that land. There should be no slavery. Well, Atchison is a senator from Missouri. Missouri is a slave state at this point, and he is very upset about the prospect of more of these states coming into the Union as free states. As we talked about in the Missouri Compromise, the biggest thing that the slave states had going for them was the fact that they had enough political power, and in fact a disproportionate amount of political power based on the 3/5 rule, in both Congress and especially the Senate. There, at this point, had already been, or also had been, the same amount of northern free states as southern slave states. Every time there would be a new state admitted to the Union, boom, another state would be admitted to the Union. That would be the opposite of what the new one just was. So there was always that tenuous balance of the situation. And with the Missouri Compromise, like we just talked about, that compromise probably pushed away the Civil War, which probably could have happened in the 1820s or 30s, but pushed it back to the 1860s, because at the very least it was this compromise that kind of made everybody happy, at least for a little while. Now that things, and like we talked about last week, everybody just pushes everything to the background, says, fuck it, somebody else will deal with this. That was the entire situation with the Missouri Compromise, saying, okay, here's the compromise. Slave states below this line, free states below this line. Missouri gets to be a slave state. Maine gets to be a free state. Hooray. We're all happy. Look at us. We're all adults, and we figured it out. All of us old white men, we figured it out. Here we go. Nothing bad will ever happen. And if it does, who gives a shit? I'll be old or dead. And the people 20, 30, 40 years from now, they can deal with this bullshit. Ha! And everybody applauded, and it was great. And that's exactly what happened. They pushed back what was at this point considered an inevitability from everybody in this country, that eventually something was going to happen, something drastic was going to happen based on the idea of slavery. Something was going to happen and boil over, whether it was going to be a complete abolition of slavery, which the southern states weren't going to, take laying down because they felt like it encroached upon their lifestyle. And, or there was going to be some sort of giant war, some sort of conflict. Who knows? Everybody knew something was going to happen. And now you get to see, as popular sovereignty and the Kansas-Nebraska Act you start to see it bubble up a little bit. Like when you're boiling water, you pour water into a pan, you crank the heat up, and you look at the water, and nothing's really happening. But you'd be wrong to think that nothing's happening, because, of course, chemically, things are happening. The heat is being added to the element of water. The molecules of water are starting to move faster and faster and faster and faster, bump into each other. until the turbulence of that bumping into each other continues to produce more and more and more heat. And eventually it becomes to a boil, producing steam, which is, the gaseous form of water escaping from, the liquid form of water. Now that you've had your chemistry lesson for the day, you can apply it as a metaphor or a simile. Sometimes I don't really get the difference between those two, at least when I'm trying to make one off the top of my head. But you can see it in the United States. The water is starting to boil. Those feelings, strong on either side, are starting to boil upward. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the thing that is going to start to topple that forward. David Acheson is the one who helped put in the literature or put in the wordage into the Kansas-Nebraska Act that would say, hey, popular sovereignty is going to be the thing. When you are a part of this territory, you get to vote on what goes on with it. And Stephen Douglas at first was very anti this. Now, Stephen Douglas was not a man who was pro-slavery by any means. He's from Illinois. By all means, he's fairly similar to Abraham Lincoln, really. When you look at the two of them, they really aren't all that different of candidates. Two pretty decent candidates for, a presidency in the United States. The big thing, though, is, of course, everything in the Senate has to be some sort of compromise. So when this happens, Acheson says, well, fuck that. Us slave states and all this stuff, we're not going to support your Kansas-Nebraska Act unless you say that there's popular sovereignty and the people that go there can decide whether they want slaves or not. Because if we don't put that in, then all these places are going to be, in his own words, overrun by free soilers, and all of a sudden the advantage in the Senate is going to fall away from the slave states and start to pop in to be, in the advantage of the free states. And of course, in so facto, here come the dominoes. Eventually, the slavery institution itself would eventually end. So now we have the heads starting to butt. Eventually, though, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is signed into law, and popular sovereignty begins. And as you can probably imagine, things went very quickly and clearly to shit. This, of course, leads us to the border war, or as I like to call it, and as it is called historically, not like I made it up or anything, Bleeding Kansas. Now, as part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, part of the territories being organized would be the territories of what? That's right, Kansas. That would be the answer to that question. And what if you're a person who's familiar with the geography of the United States? What state is right next to Kansas? I mean, right to its immediate east. What state is that? If you said Missouri, ding, 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 you are exactly correct. Missouri and Kansas are right next to each other. And we just talked about Missouri being a very fervent slave state. It was part of the Missouri Compromise because it, at that point, wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. So Missouri has been a slave state its entire time as a state and was so as a territory before that. Now that we have popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of people living in Missouri, pro-slavery people living in Missouri, wanting to now move over to Kansas where they can use their influence and their slaves and what have you to push, the popular vote in the direction of making Kansas or making that territory or whatever a slave state. They want it to be, pro-slavery just like they are. And of course, Kansas is well above the 3630 parallel line. And, in the old Missouri Compromise, Kansas would be a free state no matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many people live there that love slavery. It doesn't matter. You're going to be a free state because of that particular law. Well, now that that is over and that we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which has shoehorned in popular sovereignty, now we have a whole bunch of people running at Kansas going, oh shit, here we go. And a humongous number of those people are people from the state of Missouri wanting to, push their pro-slavery agenda in what at this point had been a mostly free state, sympathizing Kansas territory. Of course, everybody's moving into this thing, going insane. There were people from all, both the pro-slavery side of Missouri, and there were also anti-slavery groups going, hey, our people move in too. Let's just do this whole thing. And it became this, this sort of gold rush sort of thing that was happening in Kansas. Now, since a lot of the pro-slavery people were in Missouri, they tended to get to Kansas a little bit earlier, and really kind of before the anti-slavery people were there. So at first, there was a lot of pro-slavery legislation working its way through in the territory of Kansas because of things like, the settling of pro-slavery towns like the town of Leavenworth and the town of Atchison, named after David Atchison from Missouri. Franklin Pierce appointed territorial officials. He was the president at the time in Kansas to help oversee the territories. And Franklin Pierce was I wouldn't call him exactly a pro-slavery president, but he wasn't an anti-slavery president. He was very much a unionist type that figured this whole anti-slavery mentality that people were starting to adopt was very dangerous. So he was pretty much a proponent of keeping the status quo, and was okay that if slavery people wanted to do stuff in Kansas, that they do stuff there. There were things and people called border ruffians, an interesting little 1850s sort of colloquial term, or Southern Yankees as they were also known as. Most of these people from Missouri that would go in and often by fraud and intimidation would influence elections for pro-slavery purposes. In fact, in 1855, during a congressional committee investigation, they found that one of these elections had 1,729 fraudulent votes that were cast compared to only 1,114 legal votes. So more than 50% of the votes were total and other bullshit. They were fraud. It was just this whole, it was just a madhouse in Kansas once people figured out, hey, the way we're going to figure out what this state does is if we're here to vote on it. And everybody was literally bringing out the big guns. And this is when you start to see also those David Atchison, his worst opponent, those Free Soilers, they come into Kansas as well and want to make the state a free state, a state free of slavery. Many of these citizens of northern states would arrive with assistance from benevolent societies that were abolitionists, such as the Boston-based New England Immigrant Aid Company, which was founded shortly before passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act with the specific intention of transporting anti-slavery immigrants to the frontier. Everybody is sending all their people to Kansas to try to make it, whatever they saw fit and, whatever it was going to be. On March 30th of 1855, the Kansas Territory held the election for its first territorial legislature. This legislature would be the one to decide whether the territory would allow slavery. Just as had happened in the election last year, these border ruffians, here they come again, the ruffians from Missouri, start to stream into the territory to vote and to do their own particular brand of intimidation. And pro-slavery delegates were elected to 37 out of the 39 seats. Only 2 men were elected as Free Soilers. Due to questions about this electoral fraud, the territorial governor at the time, Andrew Reeder, invalidated these results in 5 voting districts, and another special election was held on May 22nd, a couple months later, to elect replacements. 8 of the 11 delegates of those places that he's declared invalid elected were Free Staters, but this still left the pro-slavery camp with a 29-10 advantage at the time. Of course, all this news of, illegality and fraud and bullshit gets to the ears of those in Washington, and Congress sends a special committee to the Kansas Territory the next year in 1856. This committee reports, and their report was conclusive, that if the election of March 30th had been limited to actual settlers, it would have definitely elected a free state legislature. They were basically saying the only reason that Kansas ever elected a pro-slavery, legislature was because of all these border ruffians coming in and roughing it up and making it so that there was a disproportionate and fraudulent election in the first place. The report also stated that the legislature actually seated was in a legally constituted body. Shots fired. and had no power to pass valid laws. Nevertheless, the pro-slavery legislature convened in the newly created territorial capital of Pawnee on July 2nd of 1855. The legislature immediately then invalidated the results of the special election in May and seated all those pro-slavery delegates anyhow, the ones elected in March. After only 1 week in Pawnee, the legislature moved the territorial capital to the Shawnee Mission on the Missouri border in, where is present-day Kansas City, where it reconvened and began passing laws, of course, favorable to slaveholders. Later in August, anti-slavery residents met to formally reject those pro-slavery laws passed by in their eyes and in Congress's eyes, the bogus legislature of Kansas. They quickly enacted their own free state delegates to separate legislature based now in Topeka, which stood in opposition to the pro-slavery government operating in Lecompton, and drafted the first territorial constitution called the Topeka Constitution. In a message to Congress on the 24th of January in 1856, the next year, President Pierce declared the Free State Topeka government insurrectionists in its stand against pro-slavery territorial officials. Maybe one of the dumbest statements a president has ever made. You can draw your own parallels there. But Franklin Pierce straight up says the Topeka Constitution, the Topeka government, which is basically made up of all these free soil type people, the ones who want to make it a free state, he says that their government is total bullshit, and that the government that Congress had already said is totally and utterly illegitimate of its own, the pro-slavery government, is the correct one, and that the Kansans have to follow now what that government was saying. So basically there are two governments trying to run Kansas at this time, and you can only imagine that tensions are going to rise a little higher. This is when a certain man named John Brown arrives in Kansas. John Brown is like the man, he's like the Chuck Norris of this story. He is ready to lay down some fucking violence to make something happen. John Brown is an outspoken abolitionist who decides to come to Kansas to fight against this pro-slavery government. On May 21st of 1856, the border ruffians, the Missourians, actually go ahead and invade Lawrence, Kansas, where the Free Staters were basically hanging out, and burned down the Free State Hotel, destroyed 2 newspaper offices, and ransacked a great deal of homes and stores. They even took a cannon used during the Mexican-American War and started shooting cannonballs out of it at, stuff in Lawrence, Kansas. Eventually, this cannon was returned to Leavenworth. In May of 1856, Republican Senator Charles Sumner, we talked about him earlier, of Massachusetts, took to the floor. This is what he talked about before. He took to the floor to denounce the threat of slavery in Kansas and humiliate its supporters. Charles Sumner was pissed. He was very anti-slavery. He was super angry about all the bullshit that was going on in Kansas. He had devoted his enormous energies to the destruction of what Republicans called the slave power. That would be the efforts of slave owners to take control of federal government and ensure the survival and even expansion of their pro-slavery ways. In the speech called The Crimes Against Kansas, Sumner ridiculed the honor of elderly South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, portraying Butler's pro-slavery agenda towards Kansas with the raping of a virgin, and characterized his affection for it in sexual and revolting terms. If you would like more details, would you like to know more? If you would like more details about that, go ahead and go back and download my The Caning of Charles Sumner episode. You would get more details about that. Since that episode is called The Caning of Charles Sumner, you can sort of guess what happened next. The next day, Butler's cousin, the South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks, took a cane and beat the ever-loving shit out of Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, trapping him underneath his desk and beating him within an inch of his life, giving him permanent neurological damage and PTSD for the rest of his life. He did not kill him, although he very much tried to do so. This action electrified the nation, brought violence to the floor of the Senate, and further deepened that North-South split. The violence then continued to increase. The violence is just getting worse. You can see how the water is starting to bubble. The boiling is starting to happen, and it's going to come to a head very soon. Abolitionist John Brown led his sons and other followers to plan the murder of settlers who spoke in favor of slavery. At a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek on the night of May 21st, the group seized 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. If you've seen The Walking Dead, this is a scene between Rick and his group, literally hacking to death another group of people that they don't agree with. That is exactly what happened here. John Brown and his men then escaped and began plotting a full-scale slave insurrection to take place at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with financial support from Boston abolitionists. This dude was absolutely not fucking around at all. He didn't even give a shit about voting. He was all about coming together, getting people on the ground, and hacking them to death with broadswords. Broadswords! Not even like fucking machetes or something. Broadswords. Like, this dude's coming out of like 15th century Europe. All of a sudden, he time travels to 19th century United States and decides broadswords are his weapon of choice. In August of 1856, a little later on, thousands of pro-slavery men formed into armies and marched into Kansas. And in that same month, John Brown and several of his followers engaged 400 pro-slavery soldiers in the Battle of Owastomi. The hostilities raged for another couple of months until Brown eventually did depart the Kansas Territory, and new territorial governor John Geary took office and managed to prevail upon both sides. Finally, after all this time of people killing each other because of a little thing called slavery, he finally managed to sue both sides for peace. This was followed by a fragile peace that was broken by intermittent violent outbreaks for a couple more years. Obviously, these things don't just end like that. They tend to simmer out and sort of fizzle. The last major outbreak of violence was touched off by the Marais de Cygnus, if I'm saying that right, massacre of 1858, in which border ruffians, there they are again, killed 5 Jesus Christ. Border ruffians killed 5 free state men. There's a lot of F's in there, a lot of alliteration. In all, approximately 56 people died in the Bleeding Kansas by the time the violence had ended in 1859. And of course, even after all this time, Kansas was not a state yet. And you know why Kansas isn't a state yet? Because the writing at this point was on the wall. It is 1858. It is 1859. What happens in 1860 and 1861, just a couple years later? If you said the Civil War, you would be correct again. And because we are just basically right at the precipice of a full-blown, secession and war among the states, you can imagine that now that the border ruffians and the pro-slavery people have been driven out of Kansas finally, that this new, free state Kansas that was going to try to get itself in the Union was being blocked in the Senate at this point by those who were the senators and congresspeople of slave states. They did not want Kansas nor Nebraska north of there to enter the Union as free states. Kansas would not enter the Union as a free state until 1861, which is, when the Civil War actually formally starts after, the bombing of Fort Sumner down in South Carolina. And at this point, there were additional, bouts of guerrilla violence erupting on the border between Kansas and Missouri, called bushwhacking, and, the term jayhawker at this point, jayhawkers being the people who are free soiler types who are anti-slavery, comes into the lexicon, and that is why Kansas, the University of Kansas, their mascot is the Jayhawk, because of this particular little part of history. And guys, that is all I really got to say about Bleeding Kansas. Not a very long episode. It's just another little portion of United States history that I think a lot of people don't really even think of. When it comes down to it, Bleeding Kansas was basically the real beginning of the Civil War, not, the actual beginning of, secession and this and that, but the fighting between pro and anti-slavery forces in Kansas and Missouri was pretty much the precursor to the Civil War. and I thought you all just would enjoy another lesson on civics. Guys, you can find this podcast anywhere podcasts can be found. Search Knowledge from the Couch podcast on Google. Literally go to google.com, put that in there. You will find everything that you need to find in terms of this podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Kyle Steinhauser. You can follow the show on Twitter at The Couch Pod. You can go contribute a little money to me, patreon.com/Kyle Has a Podcast. Please give me some money so I can continue to make the show, even though I will anyway. It's not a really great advertisement for my Patreon, but please, if you do enjoy the show and its content, please just, even throw me $1 a month. That would be extremely appreciated. Guys, I don't know what next week's episode is going to be about, but I think it's going to be about a little bit of civic responsibility. Get ready for that, guys. Knowledge from the Couch podcast, episode 47. This has been Bleeding Kansas. I have been Kyle, your host, and I hope you all live long and continue to prosper.